The grand ballroom stood still, a pristine picture of wealth and luxury, its golden chandeliers shimmering in the silence. The clock ticked slowly, its sound drowned by the soft hum of distant conversations. Lush velvet curtains swayed in the gentle breeze coming through the grand windows, offering a glimpse of the star-filled sky. The floor, a polished marble that gleamed like a mirror, reflected the glittering gowns and tuxedos of the elite. The guests, clad in exquisite silks, diamonds catching the light, seemed more like statues than people, frozen in time, as if dancing was a memory long lost in the haze of opulence. In the middle of the ballroom, standing isolated among the clusters of guests, was Alexander Grayson. He stood tall, his sharp jawline framed by his perfectly styled hair, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were vacant. His presence screamed power, yet there was a coldness to him, a man unshaken by emotion. His hand rested on the polished surface of the bar, fingers tracing the edge absently as he stared into the empty space before him. The music swirled around the room, but his feet refused to move. It was a night like any other for him, a night where the world of glitz and glamour felt shallow, and the laughter of the elite echoed hollow in his ears. The ball was the talk of the city. Invitations had been sent out months in advance, and now, here they were, all gathered to celebrate yet another success, another milestone of a billion-dollar empire. Yet Alexander, the host of it all, the man whose wealth could buy anything, stood on the outside, disconnected. His company was his life. His money was his companion. But what did he have beyond that? A few hollow relationships, a circle of friends who only saw the number on his bank account. But just as the orchestra played on, a movement at the door caught his attention. A woman. She entered late, unlike the others, not drifting in with a sense of entitlement or perfection. She was different. And though he couldn't place it, something about her caught his gaze. She was blonde, her hair shining like spun gold under the dim lights of the ballroom. But it wasn't just her beauty that stood out, it was her presence. Her confident, yet humble demeanor, as if she wasn't trying to belong, but simply existed in the moment. She looked around, her eyes meeting the crowd, but there was no sign of hesitation. Unlike the others, she didn't rush toward the group. Didn't pretend to be part of their world. Her eyes scanned the room, an almost innocent wonder in them, as if the luxury was not something she had grown accustomed to. She walked with purpose, the slight sway of her hips drawing the attention of the guests, but her gaze was far away from them. She was lost in her own thoughts, a stark contrast to the calculated smiles of the others. Alexander watched her move across the floor, his interest piqued, something unfamiliar stirring in him. She wasn't like the other women, those who were always trying to catch his eye, the ones who seemed to have it all figured out. She wasn't concerned with being noticed, with fitting in. She was simply herself. And for the first time that night, Alexander felt something. A stirring. A shift. The music grew louder, the bass heavy, urging the guests to take to the dance floor. The swirling of the orchestra's strings beckoned the ballroom to life, a call that everyone in the room obeyed, everyone, except him. He had no reason to dance. His eyes remained fixed on the blonde woman as she made her way to the side of the room, a place where no one else had ventured. She stood by the grand window, looking out at the city, her face bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. For a moment, the world outside seemed to mirror the world inside the ballroom, silent, untouched, waiting for something to ignite it. The moment passed, and the guests continued to dance, oblivious to the tension in the air. But for Alexander, something was different. His feet still refused to move, but his gaze remained locked on her. She had entered the ballroom late, but she was the only one who seemed to be truly present in the moment. Now, if this works for you, I'll proceed with the next part. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. The night unfolded around Alexander. Like an unspoken story. His world was a realm of calculated moves and strategic conversations, everything arranged, every step measured. But something about her, this stranger who had wandered in late, who stood there, bathed in moonlight as though unaware of the opulent surroundings, made him question everything. As the music swelled, the dancers twirled and spun on the polished floor, the chandelier above them shimmering like 1,000 stars. Laughter bubbled up from the guests, their voices a blur of excitement and idle chatter, but none of it reached Alexander. He felt like he was in a bubble, watching the world unfold without ever truly being part of it. His attention remained fixed on the woman by the window. The golden strands of her hair shimmered in the soft light, and he could see the subtle tremble in her hand as it rested on the sill. There was a vulnerability in her, something real, something human, that made her stand apart from the perfect facades around her. The longer he watched, the more he felt drawn to her, but he didn't move. His feet remained planted firmly on the ground. She was just another person, right? Another person in this glittering ballroom. Yet there was a spark in her, something that pulled him in, something that made him feel as though the walls he had built around himself were slowly beginning to crumble. She was different. She didn't belong here, but in some strange way, neither did he. The wealth, the luxury, it had always been a part of his life, but it never made him feel fulfilled. It never made him feel complete. He had everything anyone could ever want: money, power, influence. Yet when he looked at her, standing alone, almost lost in the sea of riches, he realized that perhaps those things were never enough. A flash of movement caught his eye. She was walking away from the window, heading toward the far corner of the ballroom. She looked lost in thought, unaware of the eyes following her. Her simple dress, elegant, yet understated, was a stark contrast to the expensive gowns and suits that surrounded her. And it wasn't just her attire. It was her entire presence, unaffected, unpretentious, as if the world of extravagance had no hold on her. The guests around her hardly took notice. The men were too busy admiring the women in their glimmering dresses, the women too wrapped up in their own affairs. But for Alexander, the scene felt different. She felt different. He didn't know why, but a part of him, a small, quiet voice, urged him to move, to speak, to go to her. But another part of him, his rational, controlling side, held him back. He had no reason to approach her. She was just a woman. A woman who had walked into his perfect world, and for some unknown reason, made it feel less perfect. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bar, his knuckles turning white. He should go over to her. It wasn't a difficult thing to do. He was Alexander Grayson, the billionaire. He could have anyone. He could take control of the situation, charm her, make her notice him. But something in him resisted. It wasn't pride. It was fear. Fear of what? Fear that the connection he felt, however brief, was too real. Too genuine. Something he couldn't control. Something he couldn't buy with money or power. The music reached a crescendo, a swelling note that seemed to demand action, to move the dancers into a frenzy. But Alexander didn't move. His gaze remained locked on her as she continued to move through the room, her presence like a beacon of calm amidst the chaos. And for a moment, he felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. Something he couldn't place, something that made his chest tighten. Could it be possible? Could she really be the one to break through the fortress he had built around himself? But no, that was absurd. She was just another guest, just another person passing through his life. Nothing more. Right? As the night stretched on, the once lively chatter began to fade into a distant hum. The glow from the chandeliers dimmed, casting long shadows across the ballroom floor. The glittering figures of the elite continued to whirl in their elaborate dance, but Alexander felt completely out of place. His focus never wavered from her. She had moved further into the room, slipping between groups of guests who gave her little more than a passing glance. She stood near the edge of the dance floor now, near the entryway where the grand staircase met the main room, as if contemplating whether to leave. There was a subtle hesitation in her steps, and Alexander noticed the slight crease in her brow. She was lost in her own world, and in that moment, he realized she was just as trapped in the artificiality of the night as he was. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt a pull towards something that wasn't driven by business, power, or desire. He didn't want to control her, or to possess her, he wanted to understand her. But how? How could he break through the walls that she had so carefully built around herself? He watched her as she glanced back toward the entrance, as if ready to leave. The moment felt fragile, like the calm before a storm, and he felt his heart beat a little faster. His mind raced with possibilities, questions, doubts, but one thing was clear: he couldn't let her walk out. Not yet. Without thinking, he stood up from the bar, the chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The sound broke through the haze of the evening like a sudden gust of wind. He couldn't let her go without at least speaking to her, without acknowledging the strange connection that had formed between them. He moved through the room, the velvet curtains brushing against his arm as he made his way to her. She turned just as he approached, their eyes meeting across the distance. There was no grand entrance, no dramatic shift in the music. It was a simple moment, but it felt like everything was suspended in time. The world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them. As the waltz continued, the world around Alexander and the blonde woman melted away. There was no longer a ballroom full of guests, no longer the weight of expectations or the crushing pressures of his wealth. All that existed was the quiet space between them, the shared rhythm of their movements, the warmth of her hand resting in his. Her touch was light, delicate, yet it grounded him in a way that no amount of money or power ever could. He had danced with countless women in his life, each time marked by a sense of obligation or control. But with her, there was something different, something raw. She wasn't performing for him, wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't even trying to fit in. She was simply there, lost in the moment, letting the dance unfold naturally, as if this was the most important thing happening in the world. Alexander glanced down at her. Her blonde hair shimmered in the soft light, her face serene and peaceful, her eyes gazing ahead, unfocused yet knowing. There was something about her, a kind of quiet strength, an authenticity that made her stand out from the sea of pretentious faces. It was as if she had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. In a world where everyone seemed to be wearing a mask, she was a breath of fresh air. For a moment, their eyes met again. This time, there was no hesitation, no questioning. There was simply understanding, a recognition that something unspoken had passed between them. Her eyes held no judgment, no expectation. She wasn't here to gain anything, to take anything from him. She was simply herself. And that, more than anything, made him feel both seen and understood. The music shifted. The waltz slowed, the orchestra's strings drawn out in a hauntingly beautiful melody. The gentle swell of the music seemed to match the shift in Alexander's emotions. The pull of the moment, the connection between them, felt both thrilling and terrifying. This was no longer just a dance, it was something deeper. It was a moment that couldn't be captured, couldn't be replicated. It was a story that had no words, only the movement of bodies and the subtle exchange of emotions. But despite the depth of the moment, something nagged at the back of Alexander's mind. The fleeting nature of it all. The realization that, just like everything in his life, this connection could vanish at any moment. She could slip away, fade into the background like so many others before her. He could return to his life, his empire, his endless pursuit of success. But for now, that wasn't what mattered. For now, there was only this. For a moment, he allowed himself to lean in closer, his hand tightening around her waist. Her breath quickened ever so slightly, but she didn't pull away. She simply adjusted, moving in sync with him, matching his pace, her body language telling him everything he needed to know. She was not afraid. She was not running, but as they danced, Alexander couldn't help but wonder, who was she? Where had she come from? What was her story? Was she like the others, pretending to be someone she wasn't? Or was there more to her than met the eye? The soft sound of heels clicking against the marble floor drew his attention. He turned his head slightly and saw that the other guests were now watching them, their eyes filled with curiosity. Whispers rippled through the room, but they were distant sounds, faint and hollow. The guests were more interested in the spectacle than the connection. They didn't understand. They couldn't. No one could, but for Alexander, none of that mattered. It was just him and her in this moment, in this dance. The rest of the world could fade into oblivion. She glanced up at him again, her eyes locking with his. This time, the look was different. It was something deeper, something that only those who truly understand one another can share. It was the recognition of something greater than either of them, a silent acknowledgement that what they had was special, fleeting, and yet undeniably real. The music shifted again, the tempo picking up slightly. The rhythm of their feet became more pronounced, the swirling dance becoming more intense. But neither of them broke their connection. They moved as one, effortlessly gliding across the floor, their movements in perfect harmony. In that moment, Alexander realized that he didn't need anything else. He didn't need the accolades, the wealth, or the power. He needed this. This raw, beautiful moment of connection that could not be bought, could not be controlled. As the final notes of the song echoed through the ballroom, Alexander felt a sense of longing deep in his chest. He wasn't ready for the moment to end. He wasn't ready to face the inevitable distance that would come after the music stopped, after the dance was over. But even as the music faded, one thing remained clear in his heart: this moment, this dance, was unlike anything he had ever experienced, and he knew, deep down, that he would never be the same again. She looked at him, her face soft, unguarded, an expression that reflected a mixture of surprise and curiosity. For a fleeting moment, she looked like a deer caught in the headlights, unsure of what to do next. And then, as if she had made a decision, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that tugged at his chest. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The question came out before he had fully processed it, but the sincerity behind it was unmistakable. It was a question that felt more like a request than a formality. The room seemed to hold its breath as she studied him. The orchestra played on in the background, the music swelling in anticipation of her answer. For a moment, she didn't reply. Instead, she glanced at the dance floor, where couples moved with practiced grace. A hint of uncertainty flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by a calm resolve. She had the kind of quiet strength that made him wonder what her life was like outside of this ballroom, what stories she carried with her that made her so unlike anyone he had ever met. "I suppose it's better than standing here alone," she said, her voice soft but confident. She didn't wait for him to make a move, she simply stepped forward, accepting his invitation without hesitation. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was genuinely nervous. He had danced countless times, with women who had caught his attention for a fleeting moment, but this felt different. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about showing off. This was real, this was vulnerable. They moved to the center of the dance floor, the crowd parting as they made their way across the marble. For a moment, Alexander forgot about everything, his wealth, his status, his empire. All that mattered was the woman standing in front of him, her hand delicately resting in his as they stepped into a rhythm that was uniquely their own. The music slowed, the orchestra's strings pulling them into a waltz. Alexander's fingers tightened around her waist, and she instinctively moved closer, as if the dance was the only thing keeping them both grounded. The world around them continued to swirl with noise and laughter, but in this moment, they were suspended in time, surrounded by nothing but the quiet melody and the soft whisper of their breath. She glanced up at him, her eyes a soft shade of blue, reflecting the light from the chandelier. For a brief second, their gazes locked, two people from different worlds, yet united by something deeper than either could understand. They danced as the evening carried on, unaware of the looks exchanged between the other guests, unaware of the gossip that would surely follow. For them, there was only this moment, this dance, this fragile connection that neither of them could explain. And in that fleeting moment, Alexander realized something. He wasn't just dancing for the sake of tradition, or for the eyes of the room. He was dancing because, for the first time in years, he felt alive. The music faded, but the silence that followed seemed heavier than any melody. Alexander's mind raced, his heart beating faster than he could remember. He had been to countless events, rubbed elbows with the world's elite, and danced countless waltzes, some mechanical, some perfunctory. But this felt different. It wasn't the graceful steps, the polished moves. It wasn't the luxury of the ballroom or the extravagance of the night. It was the connection. It was her. They stood still for a moment, the final note of the song lingering in the air like a whisper. The guests around them had returned to their own worlds, already moving on to their next conversations, their next conquests. But for Alexander and the blonde woman, time seemed to stretch. Their eyes met again, this time not with curiosity, but with an unspoken understanding. Something had shifted between them, something that neither of them had anticipated. As they pulled apart, the cold air of the ballroom hit Alexander, and the distance between them seemed to grow, but only physically. Inside, the space between them remained as intimate as ever. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to ask her name, to ask about her life. But the words wouldn't come. He was afraid. Afraid that this connection, this fragile thing they had built in those few minutes, would shatter the moment. Instead, he simply smiled, a rare smile that reached his eyes. It wasn't forced, it wasn't practiced. It was genuine, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the most honest thing he had ever done. The woman returned the smile. Though it was softer, almost as if she were holding something back. Her eyes glinted with something he couldn't quite place, something wistful, maybe even sad. And then, before he could say another word, she took a step back, breaking the silence. "I should be going," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. She didn't look at him, didn't linger. It was as if she knew the dance had been enough, that the fleeting moment they had shared was all it needed to be. She turned toward the door, her simple dress swaying with each step. The way she moved, graceful, almost ethereal, struck Alexander as something out of reach, like a dream he didn't want to wake up from. For a moment, he couldn't move. He simply watched as she made her way toward the exit, her figure becoming smaller with each passing second. The door opened, and the sound of the outside world, distant car horns, the rustle of leaves in the wind, crept in, but it wasn't enough to fill the void she had left behind. It was as if the world had just returned to its usual pace, the artificial charm of the ballroom now gone. Alexander felt a deep sense of loss settle in his chest. He wasn't ready for this moment to end. He wasn't ready to let her go. He didn't even know her name. He took a step toward the door, but as his foot moved, something inside him hesitated. What could he possibly say? What did it matter now? She had already made her decision. The dance had ended. The connection had faded, but as if fate had intervened, just as she reached the door, she paused. Without turning around, she spoke again. "Thank you, Alexander," she said, her voice laced with something he couldn't quite understand, appreciation, maybe even a touch of sadness. But it was her words that hit him the hardest. She knew his name. And somehow, that small detail, that tiny piece of information, felt like an answer to the questions he hadn't even known he'd been asking. It wasn't just her presence in the ballroom that had been different. It was her ability to see through all the layers, to look beyond the wealth and the facade, and find something real in him. Something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words failed him. There was nothing he could say that would capture what he was feeling. And before he could find the words, she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the moment was over. But Alexander didn't feel anger, or confusion, or even disappointment. He felt something else, something that was as unfamiliar as it was freeing. He felt hope. The ballroom, now filled with idle chatter and laughter, seemed like a distant echo to Alexander. The music had ended, and the last few guests were beginning to drift toward the exits, their laughter and conversations becoming just another layer in the hum of the night. But for Alexander, the world had changed. The opulent surroundings, the grand chandeliers, the carefully tailored faces of the people, it all felt meaningless now, a world he no longer fit into. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere between the dance and her departure, something inside him had shifted. He stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. Her presence still lingered in the air, the soft fragrance of her perfume haunting the space where she had stood. He could still feel the warmth of her hand in his, the gentle pressure of her body as they had swayed together in the waltz. That connection, that quiet, unspoken bond, was still with him, wrapped around his heart like a delicate thread. The minutes stretched on, but Alexander didn't move. The guests continued their dance, their conversations, their endless games of status and power, but he was no longer part of it. He wasn't sure when he had realized it, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the trappings of wealth or the empty exchanges of the night. What mattered, what truly mattered, was what he had just experienced. He turned toward the grand staircase, the same path she had walked down just moments ago, and for the first time, he noticed the emptiness of the space. The golden stairs, the marble pillars, they all seemed hollow. A part of him, the part that had been hardened by years of business, by countless deals and negotiations, longed for something else. Something real. Something that couldn't be measured by numbers or status. A soft sigh escaped his lips, and he looked up at the ceiling, the grand chandelier casting a soft glow over the room. He knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. That brief, fleeting moment of connection had given him something priceless, something he couldn't buy with any amount of money. It had given him a glimpse of who he could be, not as a billionaire, not as a businessman, but as a person, someone capable of feeling, of truly connecting with another soul. He thought of her again, the blonde woman who had danced with him, who had broken through the walls he had so carefully built. He didn't know her story, didn't know what had brought her here. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had reminded him of something he had lost along the way. She had reminded him that in a world filled with riches and power, there was something far more valuable: connection, authenticity, and the courage to be vulnerable. Alexander stood there, for what felt like an eternity, lost in his thoughts. The last guest had left, the ballroom now empty save for the echo of his own footsteps. He took a deep breath, the weight of the night pressing on him, and slowly began to walk toward the door, but as he reached the threshold, he paused. He turned back one last time, his eyes scanning the now silent ballroom, the room that had witnessed his most powerful moments, his biggest successes. For all its splendor, for all its grandeur, it no longer held the same meaning. The world outside, the one beyond the walls of the ballroom, was where he needed to be. It was there that he would find the answers he had been searching for, answers that money and power could never provide. And so, with a final glance at the empty space, he walked out into the cool night air. The stars above shone brightly, 1,000 lights in the sky, each one offering a promise of something more, something real, something that couldn't be bought. As he walked away from the ballroom, Alexander knew that this night, this moment, would remain with him forever. And though he might never see the blonde woman again, the lesson she had given him would stay with him always, that sometimes, the most important thing in life isn't the wealth we accumulate, but the connections we make along the way.